The hall was filled with polished uniforms, gleaming badges, and the quiet hum of anticipation. The ceremony was meant to honor sacrifice, bravery, and those who had returned home when others did not. Among the decorated officers, polished speeches, and media flashes stood James Mallory, a man of 73 with worn hands, a straight back, and a 1,000-yard stare he couldn't shake. He hadn't wanted to come. He didn't seek recognition, and he certainly didn't think he deserved it. But they insisted. The mayor's office, the veterans committee, even the colonel who had once commanded him, they all said the same thing: "You're a hero, James. You saved lives. You deserve this." So he stood there in an iron suit he hadn't worn in years, the tie chafing against his neck, his heart thudding not with pride but with something that felt like dread. When they called his name, the crowd stood. Applause erupted. His name echoed through the hall, louder than it ever had in life, and as he walked up the steps to the stage, he felt the weight of memories crashing into his chest like artillery. The general's assistant handed him the medal, a gleaming symbol of valor, engraved with his name. Cameras flashed. The general leaned in to shake his hand. "For your courage under fire," the man said with a firm grip. James stared at the medal. It was heavier than he thought it would be. His fingers tightened around it, and then loosened. He didn't raise it. He didn't smile. Instead, he stepped toward the microphone, clearing his throat once, the sound dry and strained like gravel. The room quieted. "I can't accept this," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. A murmur rippled through the audience. The general blinked, then whispered, "Mr. Mallory." But James stood his ground. "This medal, it doesn't belong to me. It belongs to Private First Class Nathaniel Burke." He paused. "He's not here to receive it because he gave his life, saving mine." The murmurs turned to stunned silence. James looked out over the crowd. It was April 16, 1972. We were deep in the jungle, pinned down by fire. Burke, he was just a kid. Couldn't have been more than 20. But he moved without hesitation. He dragged me out from under debris, carried me back with bullets snapping past us. He was hit before we reached cover. He bled out in the mud while I watched, helpless. James' voice cracked but he pressed on. The army recorded it as me leading the escape, protecting the squad. But the truth is, I wouldn't have survived without Burke. He never got a funeral. No medal. No parade. Just a name on a stone in a town that barely remembers him. The general looked visibly uncomfortable. The crowd didn't know whether to applaud or wait. James raised the medal again, looked at it, and set it gently on the podium. "I'm not a hero," he said. "I'm just what's left. And I won't wear a medal that should have been his." He turned and walked off the stage. A few scattered claps started, unsure and awkward. But James didn't hear them. All he heard was the familiar rhythm of boots on earth, echoing from decades ago. He left the ceremony without looking back, got in his old truck, and drove toward the cemetery he hadn't visited in years. On the passenger seat sat a photograph, faded, folded, and cracked. Nathaniel Burke in uniform, smiling like he had no idea what was coming. James parked beneath the oak tree near the edge of the veterans' field, the wind soft through the branches. The stone was there, flat and weathered. He knelt beside it and placed the medal gently at its base. "I should have done this a long time ago," he whispered. Then he sat there, not as a man being honored, but as one remembering the cost of being alive. The medal stayed there, untouched, for days. Rain came and went, soaking the velvet case until the shine dulled and the ribbon stiffened. But James didn't mind. Every morning, he came back to sit beside Nathaniel Burke's grave, speaking softly into the wind like he used to during night watch, like the silence between them had never stretched across 50 years. People began to notice. The groundskeeper, an old man with clouded eyes and a limp, started leaving a folding chair out under the oak. A nurse from the nearby clinic passed by on her lunch breaks, sometimes offering a nod, sometimes a thermos of coffee. No one asked questions. They didn't have to. There was something sacred in the way James sat, still, present, and full of a weight that couldn't be lifted. One afternoon, as the sun hovered low and golden over the horizon, a young man approached. Late 20s, clean-cut, with military posture and quiet eyes. "Are you James Mallory?" he asked gently. James looked up slowly, hand still resting on the top of Burke's headstone. "I am," he replied. The young man extended a hand. "My name's Eric Burke. Nathaniel was my great-uncle. My grandfather was his younger brother." James didn't speak at first. He just stared, his throat suddenly too tight to swallow. Eric sat beside him on the grass, unbothered by the mud. "My dad found an old box in the attic last month," he said. "Photos, letters, a draft notice. We didn't even know Nathaniel had served. I googled his name and saw the speech you gave. It spread online." James turned slightly. "I didn't know anyone was listening." "A lot of people were," Eric said. "But I was the only one with his blood." For a while they sat without speaking, watching the shadows lengthen across the cemetery. Finally, James said, "He saved me. I never got to say thank you." Eric nodded. "Well, I think sitting here all these years says more than words." James smiled faintly. "All these years I tried to forget. Then I realized forgetting was a kind of betrayal." He paused, eyes drifting over the rows of names. "I spent decades hiding from it. When I finally told the truth, it felt like I could breathe again." Eric picked up the now tarnished medal. "May I?" James nodded. Eric opened the case, gently brushing the rusted edge. "You mind if we keep this? For my family? For him?" James placed a hand on Eric's shoulder. "That's where it belongs." In the days that followed, the Burke family made arrangements. They held a private memorial, modest and quiet. Nathaniel's photo was framed beside the medal, surrounded by fresh flowers. James was the guest of honor, though he sat near the back, hat in hand, eyes on the ground. When they asked him to speak, he did. Not about war or medals, but about Nathaniel as a person, his bad jokes, his fear of spiders, his love for chocolate pudding. He wasn't a symbol, James told them. He was a person. A good one. After the service, Eric's father approached James with tears in his eyes. "You gave him back to us," he said. "We never even knew him, but now we do." James shook his head. "No, sir. I just gave you what was always yours." That night, back at home, James opened a dusty footlocker he hadn't touched since 1973. Inside were his own medals, journals, faded patches, and a crumpled letter he once tried to write to Burke's mother but never finished. He read the words again, heart sinking with guilt. "I should have sent this," he murmured. But the past couldn't be undone. Only honored. He pulled out a fresh piece of paper, sat at his kitchen table, and began to write. "Dear Mrs. Burke," it began. "I know this letter comes far too late, but I wanted you to know what your son meant to me." He wrote until his hand cramped, tears dotting the lines like rainfall. In the envelope, he included a copy of the speech, the photo of Nathaniel smiling in uniform, and oppressed. He didn't know if there were any relatives still living in her old town, but he mailed it anyway. Hope, after all, was a stubborn thing. As weeks passed, James found himself invited to schools, veteran centers, and small town halls. Not to speak about war, but to speak about truth, grief, and memory. He told audiences that heroism wasn't in medals or uniforms, but in choosing to live with honesty. The real battle, he'd say, starts after the war ends. He didn't crave the attention. But if his voice could restore even one forgotten name, he would keep using it. One morning, a letter arrived. It was from a woman named Helen, Nathaniel's niece. She wrote, "My mother used to say Nathaniel was the kindest boy she ever knew. Thank you for reminding the world of him." Tucked inside was a childhood photo of Nathaniel holding a toy plane. James held it with trembling fingers, heart aching with a strange mix of sorrow and peace. That night, he lit a candle and placed it on his windowsill. For the first time in 50 years, he felt like someone had finally come home. The candle in the window became a ritual. Each night, James lit it not out of grief anymore, but gratitude. Word had spread beyond his small town, and letters began to pour in, veterans who had carried similar guilt, children who had lost parents in wars long forgotten, and strangers simply moved by a man who gave away a medal that wasn't his. One morning, as snow dusted the ground and frost glazed the headstones, James returned to Nathaniel's grave carrying something wrapped in cloth. He knelt slowly, the years heavier on his knees than they used to be, and laid down a framed photograph. It was the one Eric had mailed him, Nathaniel holding the toy plane, frozen in a moment of boyhood innocence. James cleared his throat and spoke into the wind, "They remember you now, Nate. They finally remember." As spring approached, a veterans group invited James to speak at the state capitol. He initially declined, but Eric called and gently insisted, "You're not going there for yourself. You're going for him." So James agreed. The day of the event, he stood before a quiet crowd in a historic chamber, holding no notes, no speech, only a photograph and the crumpled letter he never sent. He told the story from the beginning, not hiding the fear, the silence, or the shame. "The medal wasn't mine," he said, voice steady but soft. "It belonged to the man who shielded me from gunfire and never came home. I wore it for too long, hoping it would remind me of him. But I know now it was never meant to be mine. I lived because of him, and that means I had to live for him too." The audience gave no applause at first, just stillness, some tears, and quiet nods. Then slowly, people stood. Not to cheer, but to honor. James simply bowed his head. Afterward, a young woman approached him. She was barely out of college, holding a military patch in her hand. "My grandfather served with you," she said. "He spoke about a man who never took credit for anything." She placed the patch in his hand. "He passed last year, but I think he'd want you to have this." James didn't argue. He just thanked her. Later that evening, sitting in his small kitchen, he placed the patch beside Nathaniel's picture. The candle flickered nearby, casting a warm glow over them both. The next morning, James made his way to the elementary school. He'd started volunteering there once a week, helping students with reading, sometimes just sitting on the playground bench while they told him stories about dinosaurs or astronauts. One boy, no older than 7, ran up to him and asked, "Did you ever fly a jet?" James smiled, ruffling his hair. "No, but I knew someone who wanted to." They sat together on the bench, watching clouds drift by, and James realized that in these small conversations, in the innocence of their laughter, he was honoring Nathaniel more than he ever could with speeches or medals. That night, James wrote one final letter. "Dear Nate," it read, "you've been with me all along. You gave me more than your shield that day. You gave me time, life, and a chance to remember you rightly. I hope I did okay. Your friend, always, James." He placed the letter in a tin box, walked quietly to the old oak tree near Nathaniel's grave, and buried it beneath the roots. No ceremony, no witnesses. Just the earth reclaiming what it had once protected. Years later, long after James had passed peacefully in his sleep, children still visited the cemetery on Veterans Day. Teachers would tell them about 2 young soldiers, one who saved the other and the one who never forgot. And beneath the oak tree, a small brass plaque now read, "For the one who wore the medal and the one who earned it, both heroes in their own way."